Welcome to the Visibility Project podcast.
Welcome to the Visibility Project podcast.
Welcome to the Visibility Project podcast.
Started by a group of citizens in a small Michigan town with a like-minded goal
of increasing the visibility
of the unseen and unheard populations in our community.
Our guests will share stories and insights
with the goal of increasing our awareness and knowledge
of various aspects of diversity and equity
to create a more connected, empathetic, and inclusive community.
So, let's get to work.
Let's get to work.
So let's get to work.
So, let's get to work.
Let's get to work.
Welcome back to the Visibility Project podcast. I'm your host, Jeremiah Lee. Spearheaded by members of the Cultural Awareness Coalition, the project is the brainchild of several organizations and individuals with shared values who sit on a project steering team. We hope that the podcast series creates a deeper empathy for others and serves as a catalyst for people to actively create a more inclusive community and world. Our last two episodes have focused on issues related to the Black Lives Matter movement and racial justice. We'll be shifting gears to focus on issues related to the LGBTQ community in this month's podcast. You'll hear our guests talk about important legislation, the importance of voting, and the passing of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. We have two exciting guests with a wealth of knowledge and experience. Jay Kaplan has been the staff attorney for the ACLU of Michigan's LGBT project since its founding in 2001. He has worked on cases including challenging undercover sting operations targeting gay men, fighting Michigan's constitutional amendment prohibiting same-sex couples from marrying, defending the validity of second-parent adoptions granted in Michigan, and recently advocating for a transgender high school student to be able to run for prom court. Jay was honored with the 2006 Unsung Hero Award from the Michigan State Bar and the 2010 Virginia Rebay Civil Rights Award from the National Education Association. He was part of the legal team of the transgender rights case filed by Amy Stevens that went to the U.S. Supreme Court. Today, listen to Jay talk about who Amy was as a person, on how she was more than just a name and headline in important legislation. Scott Ellis serves as the Executive Director of Perceptions, the Great Lakes Bay region's LGBTQ+ education, advocacy, networking, and research organization. A 2014 graduate of Saginaw Valley State University, Scott began his career in Bay City's maritime industry, managing marketing and special events for the Appledore Tall Ships and the Tall Ships Celebration Festival. Scott joined the Board of Perceptions in 2017 and became the coordinator of the Great Lakes Bay Pride Festival the same year and has since produced 4 successful events for the organization. In 2019, as Perceptions expanded, Scott accepted his current role as the organization's first full-time executive director. So I did cover some of your background and your bios, but I'm going to start with you first, Jay. But can you walk us through what your work centers around and why do you do what you do?
Sure. Well, thank you for having me here today. I'm the staff attorney for the ACLU of Michigan's LGBT project. And the ACLU as a national organization has been involved with LGBT issues for 7 decades. And there's a national LGBT project, but there's only about 5 state affiliates that have their own standalone LGBT project focusing on those issues in their state. And our project has been around since the year 2001. And I've been the staff attorney there. And so we're involved with impact litigation that's going to impact the LGBT community overall, many times challenging policies and practices that we believe are discriminatory. I'm involved in terms of public policy issues, trying at either the state or the local level, trying to get policymakers to pass pro-LGBT bills. Do a lot of education and training of different organizations and groups on LGBT rights, and very much involved in working with different coalitions within the LGBT community. And as far as my history in terms of being a lawyer, I think I'm going on my 35th year as an attorney. And when I was in law school, I always knew that I wanted to do something in the realm of social justice. And the challenge was, how do I find my niche doing that? And I feel very fortunate in my career I've been able to do so. I started working at legal services and I represented indigent tenants in landlord-tenant disputes. And then I went to work for a disability rights agency called Michigan Protection and Advocacy Service, representing the rights of people living with disabilities. And we started the first HIV/AIDS legal service program that was in the height of the AIDS epidemic at that time. And for almost 20 years, I've been at the ACLU of Michigan doing the LGBT project.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Jay. I'm going to ask the same question for you, Scott. So what does your work center around, and why do you do what you do?
Well, Jeremiah, thanks so much for having me on the podcast today. Perceptions is the Great Lakes Bay region's LGBTQ plus education, advocacy, networking, and resource organization. We've been around in the region here since 2002. And in the early years of the organization, it really operated as membership based. So you had to kind of know somebody to get in and to get information about what was happening. And this was really directly related to the closeted nature of the LGBT community at the time. Then over the years, our organization really increased its visibility on the same level as LGBTQ plus acceptance and visibility in general became more mainstream. So especially in the last 5 years, we've made a lot of efforts to increase our presence in the Great Lakes Bay region and move away from that membership structure to an organization that's welcoming, inclusive, and accessible to everyone. Now, our programs have also evolved to be much more accessible and visible. Perhaps our best known program is the Great Lakes Bay Pride Festival. We saw record attendance, both in participation and sponsor and vendor involvement back in last year, 2019. Our Harmony Diversity Choir brings together nearly 40 diverse voices who perform throughout the region. And our support services and resources are accessible not only to our LGBTQ plus community, but our countless allies in the region. I first officially met Perceptions back in 2016. And I say officially because I had known about the organization for a while. In my time at Saginaw Valley, I knew about Perceptions. I knew the work that they did in the community and how they were connected to our on-campus resident student organization, but had not officially been involved with any sort of event or program. In 2016, I saw an opportunity that was lacking for LGBTQ plus individuals to have social connections. Our gay bars in the region had been closed for a couple of years at that point, and so there was a real lack of space to gather. I started by approaching Perceptions about partnering to host a social night at a local establishment. And throughout this process, I was able to connect with the organization and began volunteering to coordinate the Great Lakes Bay Pride Festival. Fast forward 3 years to October 2019, and we found the organization in a place of rapid growth and expansion. I was asked to serve as the first full-time executive director of the organization, and I'm proud to have accepted that position and continue to serve in that capacity.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Scott. I'm so happy to have you both here and just to really learn from your knowledge, expertise, and your experiences. I want to talk today a lot about legislation. So the first question I really have for you guys is, what are some real barriers in legislation that impact members of the LGBTQ community, and how does this impact them on an everyday basis? Scott, do you want to start with this and kind of tag team with this, Jay?
Sure. I want to bring up two pieces of legislation that I think are very pertinent right now. First being the Equality Act, which is at the federal level. The Equality Act was introduced to prohibit discrimination based on sex, which would be defined as sexual orientation and gender identity. And this covers areas of public accommodation, education, federal funding, employment, housing, credit, and even the jury system. So this introduction was really important to defining what sex meant, as it's already a protected class, but it doesn't include sexual orientation and gender identity. And that's the language that we're really looking to have included in these federally protected areas. So I'll turn it over to Jay. He can speak to this much more eloquently than I can, but that's a big thing at a national level that we're all striving for.
Michigan is one of 29 states that does not, that has civil rights laws that do not explicitly mention sexual orientation and gender identity. And Scott is correct that some federal courts have interpreted civil rights laws that prohibit sex discrimination as including sexual orientation and gender identity. But rather than just leave it up to court interpretation about what that language means, we think it's very important that you have that explicit language in civil rights laws. And he's correct that the Equality Act would do that. It would be the first federal civil rights law that explicitly mentions and protects LGBT people. At the state level, our civil rights laws for more than 30 years have been attempts to try to amend those civil rights laws to explicitly include sexual orientation and gender identity. And I think the problem that we find is kind of endemic in terms of, and it just reflects the importance of our elections, because what we have found is that our leadership in terms of legislative leadership are not allowing these bills to move forward. So case in point, the Equality Act was passed out of the United States House of Representatives with a significant majority. However, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell has refused to allow that bill to go forward, even to have a hearing in the Senate. I should also mention that President Trump has indicated if the bill passed out of the Senate that he would veto it. Now, in the Michigan legislature, despite 30 years of effort to try to amend our state civil rights law, and it's true today, the current legislative leadership in both the House as well as the Senate will not move these bills forward. They won't even allow them to have committee hearings. And that's why it's very important when we participate in elections to understand and to know where these candidates stand on these issues. If we were to change the trajectory in Michigan's legislature in terms of which party is in a leadership position, that could make a difference. It's very difficult in Michigan legislature, just as a whole, to bring anything that's pro-LGBT and to see those bills move forward. And that's kind of where that's why we are stymied at this point in time.
Now, the legislation at the state level that Jay's referring to that we saw introduced in 2020, now not introduced yet, but it started as a citizens ballot initiative called Fair and Equal Michigan. And the idea was that this ballot initiative would gather signatures, would be presented to the legislature. They would have the option to act on it before potentially sending this to the ballot at a general election here in Michigan. And the initiative was to amend our state Civil Rights Act, the Elliott-Larsen Civil Rights Act, to include that definition of sex as including sexual orientation and gender identity, and get that verbiage specifically listed in the legislation as protected. So that initiative was introduced in January of 2020, and we are waiting to hear the results of the signature gathering petition, which saw many interesting challenges presented this year due to COVID-19. But the committee has worked very hard to continue pushing those efforts forward. And we should hear this month what is the future of that initiative.
Mm-hmm. And my understanding is that, they're at the point now they collected the requisite number of signatures and actually a cushion level of additional signatures. And what happens with this initiative is then it's up to the legislature to then pass, to take action to amend Elliott-Larsen's civil rights laws, or if they refuse to take action on them, then becomes a ballot initiative in 2022, where Michigan voters can vote to amend our current civil rights laws.
And that's a long ways off. So
it is, and legislation, just like litigation and court cases, take a long time, and sometimes to be able to bend, to make sure that our elected officials are paying attention to the will of the people. But like we mentioned before, it's been 30 years the effort to try to amend Elliott-Larsen. That's our Michigan current civil rights law.
Jay, has ever been taken to a ballot level?
In Michigan, it never has. Other states have tried to do that, and certainly this kind of ballot initiative through petition drive, trying to get the legislature to act, has been used, previously, before in other efforts. But this is the first time, and I think, it's a strategy that proponents of LGBT rights have said. You know what? We can't just count on introducing legislation and having it sit there. We've got to make it very clear that there's a referendum from the people that the legislature needs to act. That said, even with all the efforts and the heroic efforts of Fair and Equal Michigan, the legislature has always had it within them to be able to act on this piece of legislation and what we believe to do their jobs. So.
Well, thank you for that. And so, Jay, I will say that you are a very well-known name because of your case with Amy Stevens. So can you walk us through your case with Amy Stevens, in which this case was taken all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court? And then what impact has it had? And then what steps need to be taken next?
Sure. Thank you. Well, Amy's case is part of 3 LGBT employment discrimination cases that went up to the United States Supreme Court. 2 of them involved gay employees who were fired from their jobs when it was discovered that they were gay. And in Amy's situation, she worked for a funeral home for more than 7 years, and she was not able to be her authentic self at work. She felt she was afraid to be able to be herself. And then when she came out to her employer as a transgender woman, she was fired from her job. And so our involvement in Amy's case started back in 2013 when she was terminated from her employment. And what those 3 cases were involved is, once again, do civil rights laws that prohibit sex discrimination in employment, do they cover LGBT people? And that's what the issue was before the United States Supreme Court. So in Amy's situation, she first filed a complaint with the federal agency, which is called the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which investigated her employment discrimination complaint, found that her employer did violate Title VII, the federal law that prohibits sex discrimination, and then they filed a lawsuit in the federal district court. Federal district court found that, yes, Amy was fired because she was transgender, but felt that the funeral home, the owner, citing his religious beliefs, that superseded Amy's civil rights complaint and decided in favor of the funeral home. That issue is then appealed to the next level of the federal courts, which is the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals. Now, at that time, we're up to 2017. And the ACLU, we filed a motion to intervene on Amy's behalf to specifically represent her because we were concerned with the new administration, with the Trump administration, whether or not this federal agency would fully represent her interests. And I think we were right to have concerns about that because when the case went to the United States Supreme Court, the EEOC changed its position and opposed Amy's civil rights claim and was supporting the funeral home. But back to the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals, they reversed and they found in favor of Amy that she was protected under Title VII, and that even if the funeral home owner had a sincerely held religious belief, it's the government's compelling interest in enforcing civil rights laws. And the least restrictive way to do that is to enforce civil rights laws and to investigate these complaints. So very, very strong decision in favor of Amy and other transgender employees, and that decision was appealed to the United States Supreme Court. They decided there were 4 justices who wanted to grant certiorari, and then we went up to the United States Supreme Court in October of 2019. And then in June of 2020, the Supreme Court held 6-3 that when you discriminate against an LGBT employee because of their sexual orientation, because of their gender identity, that this is discrimination because of sex, and that Title VII does provide those protections. Historical decision because it provides, for the first time, if you live in a state that doesn't have explicit mention of sexual orientation or gender identity in those civil rights laws, now you have a remedy in terms of employment discrimination. And we also believe that the legal analysis that the court used can be used to challenge LGBT discrimination in other contexts. So, a tremendous decision, maybe not as sexy as the marriage decision, and people might not recognize it as significant in terms of LGBT rights, but it really was. Now, that sounds kind of like a cold reciting of the facts and stuff. What I'd like to talk about a little bit is about Amy Stevens, because I got to know her very well, and we became close friends through this litigation. And I think many times when we look at civil rights cases and LGBT rights cases, we really don't think about the harm that's actually done to somebody when they're discriminated against. And in her case, losing her job was devastating to her, not only, financially on the family, but also emotionally, because this was a very strong identity, a purpose in her life. She was an embalmer, and she always wanted to do that because she really wanted to help families in their most pressing emotional time of need. And to have lost that job and to lost what she felt as her sense of purpose was devastating to her. And Amy suffered a lot of health consequences. I'm not saying it was directly tied to the termination of her employment, but she went through some significant health problems along the way. And once the Supreme Court decided to take up that case, Amy was kind of thrust in the spotlight as being the face of this case and telling her story countless times, countless interviews and presentations all across the state, all around the world doing interviews. And Amy was somewhat of a shy person, but when she was able to talk and tell her story, she was quite eloquent and quite moving. And I really believe that Amy found a second purpose in her life in terms of to be the face of this case and to try to make things better for the transgender community. And I'll never forget, we went to Washington, D.C. for the Supreme Court hearing. And when Amy came out after the hearing, she was in a wheelchair. They wheeled her out on the steps. There were thousands of people out there cheering her, and people coming up to her and thanking her, many young transgender people thanking her for her involvement in the case and moving this forward. What's bittersweet about all of this is Amy's health continued to decline, and she died about 4 weeks before the decision came out from the Supreme Court. And I know that it was one of her last wishes that she would live long enough to read this opinion, which is a pretty incredible opinion. But she made such a significant contribution to the area of transgender rights, and was a very courageous and very brave person to be out there and to tell her story. And I miss her, and I know she's very much missed by people who know her. And she really made a significant contribution in her relatively short lifetime.
Yeah, and the positive impact is lasting. So that's powerful. You briefly mentioned about the 2015 decision. So there's been recent talks in the Supreme Court suggesting that narrowing the 2015 decision. So what would that mean? And then what can we do about that?
Mm-hmm. Well, I get a lot of questions about what might happen. Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg passed away several weeks ago, and now there's a rush for confirmation hearings to fill her position with a judge who in the past has opposed marriage equality, and that could result in a 6-3 conservative majority on the court. And many people have contacted me. Does that mean I'm legally married? Could they take away my marriage? I don't think what the court could do is take away people who already have the legal marriage and the recognition of their marriage. But as you mentioned, Jeremiah, it could be an effort to try to limit the Obergefell decision and what that means. And we're seeing some litigation in some courts that are saying, okay, well, yes, you do have the right to get married, but you don't necessarily have the right of the benefits of marriage. Although the Supreme Court clearly made it very clear in the marriage equality decision that it's not only the fundamental right to get married, but also to be accorded the benefits of marriage. So in other words, you might be able to get a marriage license, but the state might not have to recognize your marriage for purposes of governmental programs. And I think that's going to be where we're going to see efforts to try to do that. We're also going to see continued efforts to say, I don't have to provide services for your wedding based on my religious beliefs. If I'm a florist or I'm a cake baker or I rent out my property for weddings, I shouldn't have to recognize your marriage. You saw the efforts about the clerk in Kentucky, Kim Williams, who didn't want to issue marriage licenses to same-sex couples. So I think we're going to see more efforts to do that. And what was very frightening last week, where the Supreme Court refused to take up Kim Williams' case, Justices Clarence Thomas and Justice Alito, they both said that they thought the Obergefell decision, the marriage equality decision, should be revisited, and the court should consider overturning that decision. And what can we do about this? I think we all have to participate in in elections. Elections have consequences. They make a significant difference. If we were holding this interview back in 2016, in October, the landscape looked a lot different. That as a result of a different administration and the ability of a particular president to appoint 3 justices on the Supreme Court and many justices judges on the federal courts, these are lifetime appointments, we're seeing a significant different judicial landscape where judges will be hearing LGBT rights cases, and it could result in some negative consequences. So it is so important that the LGBT community and anybody who cares about LGBT civil rights, that they make sure that they're informed, that they know the positions of the different candidates in these elections, what they will do, what they have said they will do, and to make an informed vote. Because, like I said, there's significant consequences as a result of an election. And our federal courts have changed significantly just in the last 3 years. President Trump has been able to appoint more lifetime judges to the federal bench than any president in this particular period of time. And many of these judges who've been appointed are members of what's called the Federalist Society. Now, that doesn't mean a member of the Federalist Society means that you're against LGBT rights, but the judicial philosophy of the Federalist Society is essentially, if it wasn't specifically mentioned in the Constitution at the time the Constitution was ratified, we're not going to necessarily find a right. So, of course, there was no mention about LGBT people. And so the argument thus goes, I'm not going to be able to find a right to protect LGBT people necessarily from policies that would be considered to be discriminatory. And I think we should be concerned about that.
Thank you for that. I want to go back to talking about Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And can you both, Scott and Jay, talk a little bit more about the legacy of Ruth Bader Ginsburg in relation to LGBTQ cases and the community?
Well, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, I think one of her greatest legacies is the work that she did as an attorney on behalf of women's rights and sex discrimination, the development of Title VII law. And it was that same Title VII law that it resulted in the most recent Supreme Court decision on LGBT rights, that discrimination against LGBT people is discrimination because of sex. But when you look at in Ruth Bader Ginsburg's almost three-decade tenure on the United States Supreme Court, she was part of every majority decision in support of LGBT rights. From 1996 all the way up to this year. She might not have written a majority opinion, but she always was behind that. And, a lot of times we don't know what goes on in terms with the court. The Chief Justice decides who's going to write the majority opinion. There's a lot of, different discussion back and forth. How do you persuade a justice to come over to your side? But I imagine that Ruth Bader Ginsburg was a very strong consensus builder among the different justices. She was the one when they challenged the Defense of Marriage Act, which said the federal government's not going to recognize legal marriages between same-sex couples. During the oral argument, she talked about treating LGBT people, putting them in a skim milk marriage. In other words, not affording them the same rights. She was able to crystallize exactly what was the heart of the argument for this kind of discrimination. And the other thing about Ruth Bader Ginsburg, she was very concerned about the effort to try to use religious beliefs in non-religious settings as a means to justify discrimination against LGBT people. And her voice regarding that type of argument is going to be very sorely missed on the court, because there are other justices who might have gone along with marriage equality, might have gone along with the most recent decision about employment discrimination. But when it comes to the issue about religious justification for discriminating against LGBT people, we're not so sure that they're going to be on the side of LGBT rights. And that should be cause for concern. The very next LGBT rights case that the court's going to be hearing is November 4th, the day after Election Day. And the court's going to be deciding whether or not a faith-based organization that gets a government contract to provide foster care services, do they have a right to that contract, to taxpayer-funded monies when they refuse to work with same-sex couples? And I'm not willing to guess how this might come out with the court, particularly if Judge Coney Barrett she gets voted in on the Supreme Court and is part of the oral arguments in that case.
Yeah, today is actually October 12th here, the first day of the hearings for the confirmation hearings for Judge Coney Barrett. So as you mentioned, I think it's going to play a huge role in that November 4th decisions.
Absolutely. And we've never there's been attempts to try to use religious beliefs to justify being exempt from civil rights laws. In the 1960s, there were restaurant owners in the South who argued that the Bible says that God put races on separate continents, and therefore they should be allowed to refuse to serve Blacks in their restaurants. The courts didn't buy it then, and they shouldn't buy that kind of argument now. We have very strong protections for religious beliefs in our Constitution. There is nothing that the government can do to try to take away an individual's religious beliefs, but we've never allowed that religious belief to be used as a sword to harm other people, particularly in non-religious settings. But that's what we're seeing, an effort with the tacit approval of the Trump administration to be able to do so. And what we're effectively doing is to try to carve out exemptions from civil rights laws. And, this time it might be LGBT people that you want to have the right to discriminate against, but everything is fair game. You could discriminate against other religions. You could discriminate against people because of their sex or their gender. You could discriminate against people because of their age. All different types of things that could be exempt, and it would have the impact of gutting our civil rights laws.
Thank you for that. Hey, Scott, I'm going to ask the next one of you. This one could be a continuation about the conversation on legislation, but it's a very broad question. So answer it maybe from your work in the Great Lakes Bay region. It could be from a personal standpoint or from a legislative standpoint, but what are some of the biggest issues faced by members of the LGBTQ community that you see? It could be all legislation or other issues that you see.
I'll address that from my work here in the Great Lakes Bay region. And I think it can be summed up as a lack of access to information is one of the biggest, if not the biggest issue faced by the LGBTQ plus community here in the Great Lakes Bay region. So by that, I mean, we lack some really interesting components of what may be found in a more metropolitan area. We lack a centralized transportation system public transportation system that crosses county lines. We lack a unified media outlet that covers all the 4 counties in our Great Lakes Bay region. And those 2 things, transportation and communication, are incredibly important for getting people access to the services and resources that they need. So what we want to address as an organization is bringing all of that information together in what I'll refer to as a centralized hub, where we can then disseminate it to the individuals and organizations that are seeking that information and resources in our region. We're doing that in a number of ways. And these are all growth initiatives that our organization is adopting over the next year. These were realized as part of a needs assessment and gap analysis that we spent about 2 years conducting here in the region. And the the information that we found from that project drove everything that we're doing moving forward as an organization. So we're starting by building out a collaborative network of service providers. This could be any other nonprofit organizations. It could be healthcare, both physical and behavioral. It could be school systems, colleges and universities, any number of potential collaborative partners. And what we're doing is creating this network so that we're all connected and we understand what programs and services are currently being offered for the LGBTQ plus community here in the Great Lakes Bay region. And we use that information to identify solutions to other needs and gaps that are existing in the community. So we are working on that right now. We're actually getting ready to launch our first round of collaborative partner surveys this month. And we'll have more information on that in the coming months. We're also working to develop an online referral system that will be more comprehensive than the collaborative network. So it will include everybody who is part of the collaborative network, but it goes beyond that to include service providers like plumbers or electricians, appliance repair, car dealers, anybody who's interested in being listed on that online referral system and goes through a vetting process to confirm that they are a welcoming and inclusive company, organization, provider, or whatever that may be. So what we want to do is between the collaborative network and the online referral system, we'll really have a place on our website where people anywhere in the Great Lakes Bay region or even beyond, anywhere in Michigan or anybody who has access to the internet can come to this system and find a service provider that they may need and somebody that they want to support because that provider supports equality. So as Jay mentioned earlier, with possible discrimination in the form of bakeries refusing to bake a cake for a same-sex couple or anything like that, this directory is going to be the place to turn to say, hey, that bakery is welcoming and affirming, or hey, that DJ or that venue is welcoming and affirming, and they're actually interested in being visible for the LGBTQ plus community. So we're really excited to get that project launched. We will have an announcement coming out in the next month or so, but we did just recently receive a grant to start the initial build out of that online referral system. So that is going to take off at the beginning of the year, and we're very excited about that. We're also going to continue and expand our existing programs. So when I say continue and expand, I don't necessarily mean adding programs, but figuring out ways to get our programs more visible and in different communities within the Great Lakes Bay region. So we're going to continue working on that. And then our fourth really big growth initiative is actually identifying physical spaces in our region that we can create drop-in centers for the LGBTQ plus community. This is something we don't have right now. We don't have a physical location where you can just drop in for a program or to get help with something. But our goal is to identify those spaces and have one located in each of the 4 counties in our region. So we've got a very big, ambitious goals on our plate for 2021, but we are looking forward to getting started and have already made a lot of progress. So again, one of the biggest issues faced by our community, and especially in our region, is making sure we have efficient, accessible information in a place where you know to turn to. And that is what we hope our organization will be.
Well, those goals are big and ambitious, but they're really important. So exciting 2021, hopefully. The next question I have is about, yesterday was National Coming Out Day. So because it was just yesterday, I want to ask this question about, so what should I do if someone comes out to me, either personally or professionally? What advice would you give to someone in that situation? I'll open up to either of you.
Well, I think what everyone is looking for is they want to know that they're supported, that there is a support system in place for them who is people who are going to recognize them for being their authentic selves, and to know that they can be LGBT, and that there is somebody that's looking out for them and is going to be there for them when they need those kinds of support, when they encounter possibly discrimination or rejection by other people in their lives.
I would say kudos to you for being a trusted resource for someone to come out to, either personally or professionally. That says a lot about your relationship to not only that individual, but the perceptions that they have of you as it relates to their journey of coming out. So if, it's especially important if you're in a field, and I think we see this a lot in people who work blue collar jobs, that it's a kind of a different environment there. And when you work in an environment where you're maybe hearing disparaging things about the LGBT community, or you're hearing things that just don't sit well, I can only imagine how terrifying that would be for somebody to come out and to be visible. And so having a resource or having somebody to listen to you and affirm you is really important. So
the importance of being a good ally. Just a kind of follow-up question on that. What are some of the most meaningful ally behaviors that you would see?
I always say being visible. Being visible is so important. That's one of the biggest things that an ally can do. And whether it's waving your rainbow flag during Pride Month, but I like to say, we celebrate Pride all year long, not just in June. Making sure that as an ally, you're engaging with folks in the community that you're an ally to. And also holding organizations accountable for being accessible to allies. I think that's important. And it's something that we take a lot of pride in. We have been very active with our ally community for a number of years, and we really embrace and appreciate all of the allies that we have in our region and beyond.
Mm-hmm. And I think in addition to being visible, also speaking up. I remember when I first started in my job with the ACLU, there was a perception on behalf of many of the legislators that they didn't have anybody who was LGBT in their district. This is an issue for Detroit or for Ann Arbor. And so we needed those voices, the voices of the allied community, to say, no, this is an issue. And many people maybe aren't able to come forward and speak up because they fear for discrimination. I also think if one is to be an ally to the LGBT community, also they need to be informed on LGBT issues. And in terms of, once again, this election coming up, where do the candidates stand on this issue? If this is an important value to you, if there are people who are important to your lives who are going to be impacted by this, then one needs to make an informed choice at the election. You can't just separate it out. Well, I know that's true, but I like this. I mean, what does it really truly mean to be an ally? And I think there are members of the LGBT community who are having sometimes painful conversations with family members and friends regarding politics, and what are some of the impacts of certain leadership on their lives, and wanting family members or friends or other people who consider themselves to be allies to really understand what that means.
When you mentioned having districts that it pertains to and others that don't, it just made me laugh because, all you think of was Ahmadinejad saying that we don't have gay people in Iran.
I've heard the same thing said by a legislator in a certain area in Michigan. I don't have anybody in my community like that. Straight face, no pun intended, saying that, making that kind of statement at a hearing.
So we're going to wrap it up pretty soon. So I have a couple more questions, and it's more about takeaways for our audience. So I guess I have two questions left. And one of those is, if somebody wanted to expand their knowledge and action related to LGBTQ rights, where should they start?
Mm-hmm. Well, there are many websites, on the internet. I think you could start with the ACLU website on LGBT rights. You can see some of the work that's being done in this area. There are other organizations that are doing this work too. The Human Rights Campaign talks about various public policy issues, as well as provides what's going on in each state concerning an overview of the laws and what remains still to be done. They can contact me directly if they want to know what the law says in Michigan. What are some of the policy issues? They can just shoot me an email at kaplan@aclumich.org. But there's a lot of information out there on the internet. But I agree with Scott. I think the challenge is, how do you make this accessible? How do you let people know where they can go and where they can get that kind of information? We have so much that's out there on the internet. But how do we kind of direct people to exactly the kind of information that they're looking for?
I reiterate Jay's resources, ACLU, Michigan, and Human Rights Campaign, incredible resources. And I also encourage folks to get involved at the local level. So it's likely that now, there are very limited LGBTQ community centers here in Michigan, but we do have quite a few. And so get involved at your local level to understand what's going on in your area, and then in your state, and then nationally. We have such potential to impact things locally, which then grows to state level and to federal level. So it's important to get involved and get to know your local LGBT organization.
Yeah, that's so important, Scott. What you said, we have more than almost 4 dozen local governments that have human rights ordinances that explicitly do mention sexual orientation and gender identity. And that's because of the work of members of the LGBT community and their allies working together to persuade their local policymakers to pass these kinds of ordinances. And it's a reflection of that kind of work.
Great. Thank you for that. And so my last question is, for our listeners, what is one key takeaway you want from them after our long conversation today? What's one key takeaway that you both want our listeners to walk away with?
I want, because it's so close to November 3rd, and I call this the election season as opposed to election day, because we now in Michigan have the opportunity to vote and to either vote at our city clerk's office or through absentee ballot. We can participate. I just so want people, I want to encourage people to participate in this election. There is so much at stake. And there is a significant difference between the two candidates at the top in terms of their policies and what they would do on behalf of the LGBT community. It's so important to be engaged. I can understand that people can feel, these times that are so polarizing to understandably feel cynicism towards what is it even effective participating? But I can tell you, it really can make a difference.
I will agree with Jay. I think we probably could have said that together. Vote. That has been our big takeaway all summer long, this whole year. I also want to reiterate the importance of completing the census. So that is something that community foundations across Michigan have really teamed up this year to get the word out there, and they have tapped community partners like us with sharing that information with our audiences. I was in a meeting this morning where one of the local community foundations reiterated that please continue sharing this with your audience. We want to make sure that as many people are counted as possible. And the Great Lakes Bay region is doing a wonderful job right now. We're seeing some great rates come out, but none are at 100 yet. None of our counties are at 100%. And again, we're all about lofty goals right now. That's a lofty goal, but we have to continue encouraging people to complete their census before the end of the month. And it remains to be seen if that is the deadline or if that deadline will be sooner. So, as soon as possible, we encourage everybody to fill out your census.
Well, Jay and Scott, both of you, thank you so much for being here with us today. It's been great talking with both of you.
Thank you, Jeremiah. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks, Jeremiah.
You can stay connected with the Visibility Project by subscribing, liking, and sharing on your favorite podcasting and social apps. Look for us at the Visibility PRJ.
Financial support is needed to keep the conversation going. Go to midlandfoundation.org/give and select the Cultural Awareness Coalition Endowment Fund to be part of the project. Note podcast in your donation notes.
Thank you for listening.
We see you.
We hear you.
And together, we are making a difference.